In the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between words, secrets lived and died. They dwelt in shadows cast by typewriter keys, in the soft whisper of telegraph tapes, in the measured breathing of women bent over endless columns of numbers and letters that held the fate of nations. These were not the secrets of lovers or merchants, but the encrypted whispers of war itself, the coded conversations of submarines beneath dark waters, the enciphered orders that would send thousands to victory or death, and in rooms where no cameras were permitted, where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Young women sat with pencils and paper, unraveling mysteries that governments had spent fortunes to hide. They were the invisible guardians of language itself, transforming chaos into meaning, silence into understanding, and in their quiet dedication, they would help change the course of history. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The autumn of 1940 arrived in Washington with a crisp promise of change, though few could have imagined the transformation that would soon sweep through the corridors of government buildings and the quiet halls of academia. In a nondescript office within the munitions building, where the October light filtered through windows that had witnessed countless strategic discussions, a young woman named Genevieve Grotjen sat surrounded by sheets of paper covered in seemingly random letters and numbers. The work before her appeared as meaningless as ancient hieroglyphs to most observers. Yet within these cryptic patterns lay secrets that could determine whether America would stand ready for the storm. Gathering across two oceans, Genevieve was not alone in her vigil. Around her, other mathematicians and linguists worked with the focused intensity of scholars deciphering forgotten languages. Though the texts they studied were not ancient but contemporary, the diplomatic correspondence of a nation that many suspected would soon become an enemy. The Signals Intelligence Service, a small and specialized branch of the US Army, had been wrestling with Japanese diplomatic codes for over a year. The code they called Purple had proven as impenetrable as its name suggested, a digital fortress, built from the complexity of modern cryptographic machines. For 18 months, the brightest minds in American cryptanalysis had struggled with Purple's secrets. They knew it was important diplomatic traffic, always was, but they could not have foreseen that cracking this particular code would provide a window into Japan's most sensitive communications, including discussions of military strategy and international alliances. The machine that generated Purple's encryption was a marvel of Japanese engineering, using telephone switching equipment to create patterns so complex that breaking them seemed nearly impossible. Then, on a September morning that began like countless others, Genevieve noticed something that her colleagues had missed. In the endless streams of intercepted Purple messages, she detected a pattern, a subtle correlation that suggested the machine's internal workings followed predictable rules, even within its apparent randomness. It was the kind of breakthrough that could only come from months of patient observation, from a mind trained to see order within chaos. Her discovery would prove to be the key that unlocked not just Purple's secrets, but America's ability to read Japan's most sensitive diplomatic communications throughout the coming war. Frank Rallett, who led the Purple Project, would later describe that moment as one of the most significant in the history of American cryptanalysis. With Genevieve's insight as a foundation, the team was able to construct their own Purple analog machine, a mechanical mirror of the Japanese original that could decrypt their messages as quickly as they could be intercepted. The implications were staggering. America could now listen in on conversations between Tokyo and its embassies around the world, gaining unprecedented insight into Japanese intentions and strategy. Yet even as this intelligence victory unfolded in the classified world of American cryptanalysis, a larger transformation was beginning. The war in Europe had been raging for over a year, and while America remained officially neutral, it was becoming increasingly clear that the nation would soon be drawn into the conflict. The traditional military establishment found itself facing a crisis of manpower that would require solutions as innovative as the cryptographic breakthroughs being achieved in the munitions building. The problem was both simple and profound. There were not enough men to do all the work that modern warfare demanded. Every clerk, every radio operator, every analyst who remained stateside was a potential soldier who could not be sent to the front lines. In the cryptanalytic services, this challenge was particularly acute. The work required specialized skills, training, linguistic ability, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that could not be quickly taught to replacement personnel. Moreover, the security requirements meant that only the most trustworthy individuals could be granted access to America's most sensitive intelligence operations. It was in this context that military leaders began to consider a proposition that would have seemed radical just a few years earlier. Perhaps women could take on roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. Not in combat. Certainly, that remained unthinkable to most, but in the growing array of technical and administrative positions that modern warfare required. The idea gained momentum as reports arrived from Britain, where women were already playing crucial roles in intelligence work, including the top-secret operations at Bletchley Park. The British experience offered compelling evidence that women could excel in cryptanalytic work. At Bletchley Park, the government code and Cipher school had recruited hundreds of women from universities, schools, and civilian life to work on breaking German codes. Many were mathematicians or linguists, but others had been selected simply for their intelligence and aptitude for detail-oriented work. The results spoke for themselves. British cryptanalysts, working in teams that were predominantly female, had achieved remarkable successes against German ciphers, including the famous Enigma machine. As 1941 progressed, and the likelihood of American entry into the war increased, military planners began to develop formal structures for incorporating women into the armed forces. The process was neither simple nor universally supported. Many officers questioned whether women could handle the physical and emotional demands of military service, even in non-combat roles. Others worried about the impact on morale and unit cohesion. But practical necessity was a powerful argument, and the shortage of qualified personnel continued to grow more acute. President Franklin Roosevelt himself became convinced of the need for women's military service. He had seen the reports from the intelligence services about the success of female cryptanalysts and understood that the nature of modern warfare required every available talent to be mobilized. On May 15, 1942, he signed the bill establishing the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later to become the Women's Army Corps. 2 months later, he signed similar legislation, creating the Waveswomen accepted for volunteer emergency service within the Navy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. When the Army announced that it would accept applications for officer training in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, over 10,000 women reported to recruiting stations on the first day alone. The applications had to be returned within a week. Yet the Army received more than 35,000 responses for fewer than 1,000 available positions. The Navy experienced similar enthusiasm, receiving nearly 25,000 requests for applications for just 900 officer Commissions. These numbers revealed something profound about American women's readiness to serve their country. Many were college graduates who brought advanced degrees in mathematics, linguistics, and other fields directly relevant to intelligence work. Others were teachers, librarians, and office workers whose skills in organization and attention to detail would prove invaluable in the meticulous work of cryptanalysis. What they shared was a desire to contribute meaningfully to the war effort and a willingness to enter a world that had previously been closed to them. The recruitment process for cryptanalytic positions was particularly selective. Both the Army and Navy required candidates to meet officer qualifications, which meant college education or equivalent experience, as well as demonstrated competence in mathematics or foreign languages. But beyond technical qualifications, military leaders placed the highest premium on character and trustworthiness. As Captain Lawrence Safford of the Navy's Cryptologic Office noted in a memo, integrity was the primary concern. Individual qualifications were secondary and could be developed through training, but loyalty and discretion could not be taught. The security investigations required for cryptanalytic work were exhaustive and time-consuming. Investigators examined every aspect of a candidate's background, her citizenship status, family connections, financial situation, and personal associations. They looked for any indication that she might be susceptible to foreign influence or blackmail. The process often took months, during which desperately needed personnel remained unavailable for assignment. But given the sensitive nature of the work, these women would have access to some of America's most closely guarded secrets. The delay was considered an acceptable price for security. While the formal recruitment process proceeded, the war continued to expand America's intelligence requirements. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had brought the United States fully into the conflict, but it had also revealed dangerous gaps in American intelligence capabilities. The success of the Japanese surprise attack demonstrated that America needed not just better intelligence gathering, but also more sophisticated analysis and faster processing of the information that was collected in the months following Pearl Harbor. The Signals Intelligence Service expanded rapidly. From a pre-war staff of 331 people, both military and civilian, the organization grew to thousands of personnel working around the clock to intercept, decrypt, and analyze enemy communications. The Navy's Communications Security Section, OP2OG, experienced similar growth, expanding from 730 people before the war to several thousand by 1943. This expansion created opportunities for the newly recruited women, but it also presented logistical challenges that would test the military's ability to adapt to its changing composition. The training programs established for these new cryptanalysts reflected both the urgency of wartime needs and the careful attention to security that the work required. Initial training was conducted at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and later transferred to Vint Hill Farm Station in Virginia. The curriculum was intensive and comprehensive, covering not just the technical aspects of cryptanalysis, but also the broader context of signals intelligence within military operations. Students learned about cryptographic security, military organization, elementary and advanced cryptography, and the operation of the mechanical and electronic equipment that was beginning to revolutionize the field. For many of the women entering this training, it represented their first exposure to the intersection of mathematics and warfare. They learned that modern military communications relied on increasingly sophisticated codes and ciphers, and that breaking these systems required both technical knowledge and creative thinking. The instructors emphasized that cryptanalysis was As much an art as a science success often depended on intuition and pattern recognition, as much as on mathematical formulas. The Navy took a somewhat different approach to training, establishing cryptology classes at several colleges even before the war to create a pool of trained personnel. At Goucher College in Baltimore, English professor Ola Winslow taught secret cryptology classes in a locked room on the top floor of Goucher Hall. After graduating, most of her students chose to join the Waves and received additional training at Smith College or Mount Holyoke. This collegiate approach to training reflected the Navy's recognition that cryptanalytic work required the kind of analytical thinking that was best developed through higher education. As these training programs graduated their first classes, the graduates found themselves assigned to facilities that were expanding almost as rapidly as the organizations themselves. The Army's Signals Intelligence Service had outgrown the munitions building and relocated to Arlington Hall, a former junior college for girls in Virginia. The new facility was massive. By the standards of the time, it would eventually become the largest message center in the world. Similarly, the Navy moved its cryptographic operations from the Navy Department building in Washington to Mount Vernon Seminary, another former girls' school that became known as the Naval Communications Annex. The irony of housing America's most secret military operations in former educational institutions for young women was not lost on contemporary observers. These buildings, which had once echoed with the voices of students studying literature and history, now hummed with the sound of mechanical calculators and teletypes processing intercepted enemy communications. The transformation served as a powerful symbol of how thoroughly the war was reshaping American society and challenging traditional assumptions about women's roles. Within these converted academic buildings, a new kind of intellectual community was taking shape. Men and women, civilians and military personnel, worked side by side on problems that would have challenged the greatest minds of previous generations. Many had backgrounds in mathematics or engineering, but the demands of cryptanalytic work also drew from fields like linguistics, music, and even chess, any discipline that required pattern recognition and logical thinking. The Navy's Enigma office became known as the Office of College Professors because so many of its personnel held advanced degrees. Among the civilian cryptanalysts, one figure stood out for her extraordinary contributions to the field. Agnes Driscoll, known to her colleagues as Miss Aggie, had been working in Navy cryptanalysis since World War I. Originally a mathematics teacher, she had discovered her calling in the emerging science of cryptology and had become one of the most skilled practitioners in the world. Her colleagues credited her with making breakthrough discoveries in most of the Japanese naval codes that the Navy worked on during the war. Her presence in the organization served as an inspiration to the newly arrived women, demonstrating that cryptanalytic work could provide a lifetime career for those with the talent and dedication to pursue it. The work that Agnes Driscoll and her colleagues performed was governed by an atmosphere of secrecy that was absolute and uncompromising. Every person working in cryptanalysis, whether military or civilian, was required to sign statements under the Espionage Act, acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure of classified information could be punishable by death during wartime. The briefings that new personnel received emphasized this point repeatedly, as one WAC veteran recalled decades later. The first and most important instruction was simply don't talk. This culture of secrecy extended to every aspect of the work environment. Personnel wore multiple identification badges and were required to show them to armed guards at every checkpoint. The buildings themselves were designed to prevent unauthorized access, with controlled entry points and restricted areas that were clearly marked and heavily monitored. Workers were instructed to tell anyone who asked about their duties that they were performing secretarial work, a deliberately misleading but plausible cover story that would deflect further inquiry. The psychological impact of this enforced secrecy was significant, particularly for young women who were far from home and family for the first time. They could not share details of their work with loved ones, could not seek advice or support when facing professional challenges, and often could not even fully understand how their individual contributions fit into the larger war effort. As one WAV cryptanalyst recalled, "We weren't supposed to know anything. We just did something and it didn't all fit in. We didn't know the big picture." This compartmentalization was deliberate and necessary for security, but it also meant that many of the women working in cryptanalysis never fully appreciated the significance of their contributions. The radio operators intercepting enemy messages rarely learned what intelligence was derived from their transcriptions. The machine operators processing coded communications through cryptanalytic equipment seldom discovered whether their work had helped save lives or win battles. They performed their duties with dedication and precision, trusting that their efforts mattered even when they could not see the results. As 1942 progressed, and the first waves of trained women began their assignments, the pace of work intensified dramatically. The global nature of World War II meant that intelligence requirements operated around the clock. Enemy communications were intercepted and processed without regard for normal business hours or conventional work schedules. The facilities at Arlington Hall and the Naval Communications Annex began operating on a 24/0 basis, with personnel working in rotating shifts to ensure continuous coverage. This shift work presented particular challenges for the women in cryptanalysis. Most had never worked nights before, and the adjustment to irregular schedules proved difficult. The military had limited experience in housing and feeding large numbers of women, particularly those working unconventional hours. Initial arrangements were often inadequate. Women working the midnight shift might find themselves trying to sleep in dormitories, where their day shift roommates were conducting normal activities. Meal schedules designed for traditional military operations did not account for personnel who needed breakfast at sunset or dinner at sunrise. Despite these logistical challenges, the women adapted with remarkable resilience. They developed informal support networks, shared sleeping arrangements based on shift schedules, and found ways to maintain morale despite the isolation that their security requirements imposed. Many would later recall this period as among the most challenging but also most rewarding of their lives. They were doing work that mattered, using their intellectual abilities in service of their country's survival, and proving that women could excel in fields that had previously been closed to them. The work itself was becoming increasingly sophisticated as both sides in the global conflict deployed more advanced cryptographic systems. The early successes against Japanese diplomatic codes like Purple had been followed by new challenges as military communications proved even more complex and heavily defended. German military communications, encrypted using the famous Enigma machines, represented a different class of problem entirely. While the British had achieved remarkable success against Enigma at Bletchley Park, American cryptanalysts were beginning their own efforts against German communications intercepted in the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters. The technical complexity of these modern cipher systems required not just mathematical skill, but also mechanical and electronic expertise. The cryptanalytic machines being developed to attack enemy codes were marvels of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. The American bomb machines, designed to help break Enigma-encrypted messages, were room-sized devices filled with complex mechanical rotors and electrical circuits. Operating these machines required both technical knowledge and careful attention to detail. A single mistake in setup could invalidate hours of computation. As 1943 began, the women who had answered their country's call to cryptanalytic service were proving themselves indispensable to America's intelligence efforts. They had mastered skills that few could have imagined learning just a few years earlier, adapted to working conditions that would have seemed impossible in peacetime, and maintained absolute secrecy about work that was helping to shape the course of the war. They were part of a transformation that extended far beyond the intelligence services. American society itself was discovering new possibilities for women's contributions to national defense and technological advancement. The young woman who sat in a Washington office building, surrounded by intercepted messages and mechanical calculators, could not have known that she was participating in a revolution. She focused on the immediate task before her, finding patterns in seemingly random letters, testing hypotheses about enemy cryptographic procedures, or operating the complex machines that processed thousands of characters per minute. But she was also part of something larger, the emergence of a new kind of warfare in which information was as important as ammunition, and in which the ability to protect and penetrate secrets could determine the difference between victory and defeat. The story of these women codebreakers was just beginning. In the months and years that followed, they would face challenges that tested not only their technical abilities, but also their physical endurance and emotional resilience. They would work in conditions of extraordinary secrecy, knowing that their efforts could save countless lives, but unable to share that knowledge with anyone outside their classified world. They would help win battles they could never discuss and make discoveries that would remain secret for decades after the war's end. And as autumn gave way to winter in Washington, as the war expanded across every ocean and continent, these women settled into their new roles with a determination that matched the magnitude of the challenges they faced. They had volunteered to serve in a conflict that would reshape the world, and they were ready to use every skill, every insight, and every hour of dedication to ensure that their side would emerge victorious. The silence between heartbeats continued to hold its secrets, but now there were those who could listen, who could understand, and who could transform enemy whispers into allied advantage. The codebreakers had taken their positions, and the real work was about to begin. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Smith College like whispered secrets refusing to lift. In dormitories that had once housed students preparing for lives as teachers, wives and mothers, young women now prepared for something entirely different, something they could never speak of, something that would consume their days and haunt their dreams for decades to come. Lieutenant Commander John Redman stood before a classroom of 37 women, each selected from thousands of applicants for qualities that extended far beyond mathematical aptitude or linguistic skill. They possessed something rarer, something that could not be taught or measured on, unshakable. Integrity that would hold firm under the weight of secrets that could topple nations. The women sat with perfect posture, their new naval uniforms still crisp with the scent of fresh cotton and the promise of purpose. Some had left behind teaching positions in small-town schools. Others had abandoned graduate studies in mathematics and languages. All had answered a call they didn't fully understand, drawn by recruitment notices that spoke in careful euphemisms about highly confidential work and duties vital to national security. Commander Redman's voice carried the weight of both authority and solemnity as he began their initiation into a world where silence was not merely golden, it was survival itself. "What you will learn here," he said, his words falling like stones into still water, "must never leave these walls. The penalty for speaking of this work to anyone your mothers, your sisters, your closest friends is not merely dismissal. It is treason, punishable by death." The room held its breath. Some women felt their hearts quicken. Others experienced a settling calm, as if they had finally found their calling. Ruth Leverance from Wisconsin folded her hands carefully in her lap, her mind already racing ahead to the mysteries they would unravel. Beside her, Anne Caracristy from Pennsylvania felt the same magnetic pull toward the unknown that had drawn her to advanced mathematics despite her family's gentle suggestions that she pursue something more suitable for a young lady. The oath they would take was not written on paper, was carved into their souls through repetition and the gravity of the moment. They raised their right hands and spoke words that would bind them to silence for 50 years. "I solemnly swear to defend the secrets entrusted to me, to speak of my work to no one, and to carry this burden with honor until my dying day." Their voices merged into a single, unified promise that seemed to echo beyond the classroom walls and into the very heart of the war itself. Training began immediately, immersing them in a world where letters became numbers, where patterns hidden within apparent chaos could reveal the enemy's deepest intentions. They learned the intricate dance of frequency analysis, where each letter of the alphabet possessed its own personality, appearing most often in English text, Q almost always accompanied by U, Z, lurking rare and elusive at the edges of possibility. Professor Mary Hayes, a mathematician borrowed from Wellesley College, guided them through the labyrinthine world of cipher systems with the patience of a gardener tending delicate seedlings. She taught them to see beyond the surface randomness of encrypted text, to recognize the subtle signatures left by human language even when disguised by the most sophisticated machines. Every cipher, Professor Hayes explained while moving between the rows of desks where women bent over worksheets covered in seemingly meaningless letter combinations, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. The human mind, no matter how clever, cannot entirely eliminate the patterns that make communication possible. Our task is to find those patterns, to coax them into the light where they can reveal their secrets. The work was meticulous, demanding, a level of concentration that few of these women had ever experienced. They spent hours analyzing single paragraphs of intercepted text, searching for repetitions that might indicate commonly used words or phrases. The German word, under meaning, and appeared frequently enough in military communications to serve as a foothold into more complex encryptions. Similarly, weather reports often began with predictable phrases about atmospheric conditions, creating cribs that could unlock entire messages. Days blended into nights as the women absorbed not just the technical aspects of cryptanalysis, but also the broader context of their mission. They learned about the German Enigma machine, that ingenious device that scrambled messages through a series of rotating wheels, creating billions of possible combinations. They studied the Japanese diplomatic codes, the purple cipher that had already yielded some of its secrets to American cryptanalysts. They memorized the structure of military communications, the formal language that commanders used when ordering troop movements or supply deliveries. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think like their adversaries. They studied German military doctrine, Japanese cultural patterns that influenced diplomatic language, and the psychological tendencies that led cryptographers to make subtle but crucial errors. The enemy, they discovered, was human prone to shortcuts, repetitions, and the unconscious habits that could provide the key to unlocking their most carefully guarded secrets. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the rolling countryside of Buckinghamshire, another group of young women was discovering their own destiny among the huts and buildings of Bletchley Park. The estate, with its Victorian mansion and sprawling grounds, had been transformed into Britain's most secret installation, place where the brightest minds of the Commonwealth gathered to wage war with mathematics and intuition. Patricia Davies stepped off the train at Bletchley Station with a small suitcase and a heart full of questions she knew would never be answered. The recruitment letter had been maddeningly vague, speaking only of work of national importance and requesting her presence at an address that seemed to belong to a country house rather than a government facility. She had left her position as a mathematics instructor at a girls' school in Wales, drawn by promises of challenging work and the opportunity to contribute to the war effort in ways that remained tantalizingly undefined. The estate revealed itself gradually as she walked up the long drive, past gardens where roses bloomed incongruously beside utilitarian wooden huts. The main house stood like something from a Gothic novel, its red brick facade and elaborate towers speaking of Victorian grandeur. But the huts scattered across the grounds told a different story, a story of urgent purpose and barely controlled. Chaos Hut 6 would become Patricia's world, though she would not learn its designation until much later. Inside its modest walls, a team of cryptanalysts worked round the clock to break the German Army and Air Force Enigma codes. The hut hummed with the quiet intensity of absolute concentration, the sound of typewriter keys clicking as messages were transcribed, the rustle of paper as worksheets were passed between analysts, and the occasional exclamation of triumph when a particularly stubborn cipher yielded its secrets. The women who worked in Hut 6 came from diverse backgrounds but shared certain essential qualities. Many were linguists, graduates of Cambridge and Oxford, who spoke German fluently and understood the subtle nuances of military terminology. Others were mathematicians, attracted by the pure intellectual challenge of pattern recognition and logical deduction. A few were simply brilliant generalists, women whose minds operated on frequencies that allowed them to see connections invisible to others. Anne Mitchell arrived at Bletchley Park on the same day as Patricia, though they would not meet for several weeks due to the compartmentalized nature of the work. Anne's assignment was to Hut 8, where the more complex German naval codes were analyzed. The Kriegsmarine used a different version of the Enigma machine, one with additional complications that made it significantly more difficult to break. But breaking it was essential. German U-boats were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic, and only by reading their communications could the Royal Navy hope to counter their attacks. The naval section was supervised by Alan Turing, a young mathematician whose mind operated according to principles that seemed to transcend ordinary human logic. Turing moved through the hut like a benevolent but absent-minded professor, his clothes perpetually rumpled, his conversation jumping between profound insights and seemingly random observations about everything from the mating habits of flowers to the mathematical properties of crystalline structures. Anne found herself both intimidated and inspired by Turing's presence. He had a way of asking questions that seemed simple on the surface, but revealed depths of complexity upon reflection. Why, he might ask, while studying a particularly troublesome message, do you suppose the Germans chose to use the letter Q in this position? What does that suggest about the operator's mental state, or perhaps about the urgency of the message itself? The work in Hut 8 required not just mathematical skill, but also a kind of psychological intuition. The naval operators who used the Enigma machines were human beings, subject to fatigue, boredom, and the small lapses in judgment that could provide crucial insights. An operator might unconsciously choose his girlfriend's initials for a wheel setting or use the same letter combination multiple times because it was easy to remember. These human weaknesses, multiplied across thousands of operators and millions of messages, created the tiny cracks through which the cryptanalysts could peer into the enemy's secrets. The women of Bletchley Park developed their own culture, their own ways of coping with the isolation and intensity of their work. They lived in billets scattered throughout the surrounding villages, sometimes in private homes, where bemused landlords tried to understand why these quiet young women left for work at all hours and returned exhausted but unable to speak about their days. Other times they shared quarters in commandeered buildings, creating makeshift families bound together by shared secrets and mutual dependence. Meals were often communal affairs, though conversation remained carefully circumscribed. They might discuss a film they had seen in the local cinema, or share news from letters home. But the work that consumed their waking hours remained unmentionable. This created a peculiar intimacy among them. They knew each other's habits, quirks, and personal histories, while remaining strangers to the most significant aspects of their daily lives. The letters arrived like clockwork, carrying news from a world that seemed increasingly distant from the secret corridors where the women now spent their days. Margaret Byrne opened her mother's latest correspondence in the small boarding house room she shared with 3 other Bletchley workers. The familiar handwriting, a bridge across the chasm that had opened between her former life and her current existence. Dearest Margaret, the letter began in her mother's careful script. We hope you are well in your secretarial position. The vicar asked after you last Sunday, and I told him you were doing important work for the government, though I confess I don't entirely understand what sort of typing could require such secrecy. Father says not to worry. The government work has always been full of unnecessary formalities. Margaret folded the letter carefully, her chest tight with the weight of deception. If only her parents could know that she wasn't typing letters or filing documents, but instead unraveling the mathematical mysteries that protected Hitler's most secret communications. That morning she had helped break a message revealing German troop movements in North African intelligence that would save hundreds of Allied lives. Yet she must continue to let her family believe she was nothing more than a glorified secretary. The burden of secrecy pressed differently on each woman. Some, like Patricia Davies, found a strange comfort in the compartmentalization, as if the secret nature of their work allowed them to inhabit a separate identity where they could be purely intellectual beings, free from the domestic expectations that had previously defined their possibilities. Others struggled with the isolation, the sense that they were living double lives where their most meaningful achievements had to remain forever hidden. Ruth Lee Vrance, working her first night shift at the Nebraska Avenue facility in Washington, felt the loneliness most acutely during the small hours of the morning when the building fell into an almost cathedral-like quiet. She moved between the rooms filled with cryptanalytic machines, the bombs that clicked and whirred as they tested millions of possible Enigma settings, searching for the combinations that would unlock the day's German communications. The bombs were magnificent and terrifying in their mechanical complexity. Each machine stood about 6 feet tall and contained dozens of rotating drums that mimicked the action of Enigma rotors. As the drums spun through their endless combinations, the machines tested each possibility against the characteristics of German language, searching for the settings that would transform gibberish into readable text. When a promising combination, was found, the machine would stop with a mechanical clack that sent operators hurrying to record the settings and test them against the day's intercepted messages. Ruth learned to read the moods of the machines, to sense when a particular bomb was struggling with an especially difficult problem, or when the settings they were testing were leading toward a breakthrough. The work required not just technical knowledge, but also a kind of mechanical empathy, the ability to understand the machine's logic and guide it toward productive paths of investigation. The night shift brought its own unique challenges. The building felt different in darkness, filled with shadows that seemed to hold secrets even deeper than those they worked with every day. The skeleton crew of operators moved through their routines with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to working while the rest of the world slept. They communicated in whispers and gestures, mindful that their voices might carry to officers where different, perhaps even more sensitive work was being conducted. During her break, Ruth would sometimes step outside into the Washington night, breathing air that carried the scent of cherry blossoms or autumn leaves, depending on the season. The normal city continued around the Nebraska Avenue, complex people, sleeping in their beds, perhaps dreaming of loved ones overseas or worrying about ration stamps and victory gardens. They had no idea that just beyond their awareness, women like Ruth were working to end the war that touched every aspect of their lives. Back at Bletchley Park, the arrival of the Colossus computer marked a new phase in the secret war. This electronic marvel, larger than any machine the women had previously encountered, was designed to attack the German High Command's most sophisticated cipher system, the Lorenz teleprinter code that the British called Tunny. Unlike the relatively straightforward Enigma system, Tunny employed 12 coding wheels and mathematical operations so complex that only an electronic brain could hope to unravel them. Eleanor Ireland was among the first group of women selected to operate Colossus, chosen for her mathematical background and her demonstrated ability to work accurately under pressure. The machine occupied its own room, a chamber filled with the warm glow of hundreds of vacuum tubes and the constant whisper of cooling fans. Paper tape ran through the machine's reading mechanism at incredible speed, carrying encrypted messages that would be tested against thousands of possible key combinations. Learning to operate Colossus required mastering an entirely new kind of precision. The paper tapes had to be perfectly prepared. Any tear or misalignment could ruin hours of work. The machine's switches and dials had to be set according to complex instructions that changed with each problem, requiring operators to maintain absolute accuracy while working at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The work was physically demanding as well as intellectually challenging. The room containing Colossus was kept uncomfortably warm by the heat generated by its vacuum tubes, yet the operators couldn't afford to become drowsy or inattentive. A single mistake in setting up a run could waste precious time when enemy communications were streaming in faster than they could be processed. But there was also something almost mystical about working with Colossus. The machine seemed to possess a kind of electronic consciousness, its vacuum tubes glowing like the neurons of a vast artificial brain as it pondered the mathematical relationships hidden within seemingly random text. When a successful run produced readable German, there was a moment of almost spiritual satisfaction, the sense that human intelligence and mechanical precision had combined to peer directly into the enemy's most protected thoughts. Sitting in the sparse cafeteria at Arlington Hall, Anne Caracristy stared at her cup of weak coffee and tried to process what she had just read. The decrypted Japanese message spread before her contained details of troop movements that would determine the fate of thousands of American soldiers in the Pacific. The mathematics that had revealed these secrets felt suddenly insignificant, compared to the human lives that hung in the balance. This was the moment when many of the women cryptanalysts first truly understood the weight of their responsibility. They were not merely solving intellectual puzzles, they were holding threads that connected directly to the survival of their brothers, boyfriends, and friends fighting on battlefields around the world. Every message they successfully could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe, between soldiers returning home and families receiving devastating telegrams. The knowledge was both empowering and crushing. These young women, many of whom had been told throughout their lives that their intellectual capabilities were secondary to their domestic potential, found themselves wielding influence over military operations that generals and admirals depended upon. Yet they could never speak of their accomplishments, never seek recognition for insights that might alter the course of history. At Bletchley Park, the women working on the Enigma problem began to see their successes reflected in the broader progress of the war. When they broke a message revealing the location of German U-boats, the subsequent reports of successful convoy operations felt like personal victories. When their work uncovered details of upcoming German offensives, the prevention of disasters that never occurred became their silent celebration. But the work also brought them into intimate contact with the enemy's humanity. The messages they decrypted were not abstract military communications, but rather the words of individual German and Japanese operators, young men not so different from their own brothers and sweethearts. Sometimes the messages contained personal details, complaints about food quality, concerns about families back home, or expressions of war weariness that transcended national boundaries. This proximity to the enemy's thoughts created a complex, emotional landscape for the women cryptanalysts. They developed a professional respect for particularly skilled enemy cryptographers, noting their techniques and admiring their innovations even while working to defeat them. Some messages revealed the German operators' growing awareness that their codes were being broken, leading to touching attempts to improve security that the Allied cryptanalysts could follow like a conversation across enemy lines. The Japanese codes presented different challenges and different insights. The diplomatic messages encrypted in the purple cipher system revealed the complex negotiations taking place within Japan's government, the tensions between military and civilian leadership, and the growing recognition that the war might not end as favorably as initially hoped. Reading these communications gave the American cryptanalysts an almost godlike perspective on their enemies' decision-making processes, allowing Allied leaders to anticipate diplomatic moves and military strategies with unprecedented accuracy. Genevieve Grotchen, whose breakthrough into the purple system had established her reputation as one of America's most gifted cryptanalysts, found herself assigned to increasingly complex problems as the war progressed. Her work required not just mathematical skill, but also cultural intuition, the ability to understand how Japanese diplomats thought and expressed themselves, the formal patterns of their language that persisted even when encrypted beyond recognition. Working with purple messages, Genevieve developed an almost uncanny ability to sense when a message contained information of unusual importance. Something in the rhythm of the encrypted text, the length of the message, or the pattern of its transmission would signal that this communication carried weight beyond the ordinary. Her supervisors learned to pay special attention when Genevieve flagged a message as potentially significant, knowing that her intuition had proven reliable time and again. The success of the cryptanalytic effort began to create new pressures as well as new opportunities. As the volume of intercepted communications increased, the need for more sophisticated analysis became apparent. Messages had to be not just decrypted, but also evaluated, prioritized, and distributed to the appropriate military and political leaders. This created opportunities for women to move beyond purely technical roles and into positions requiring analytical and strategic thinking. Some women found themselves becoming specialists in particular types of intelligence, experts in German, submarine operations, or authorities on Japanese diplomatic procedures, or analysts capable of extracting tactical information from seemingly routine administrative messages. These specializations gave them unique value within the intelligence community and began to blur the traditional boundaries between technical support roles and strategic decision-making positions. The war was teaching these women that their minds were capable of achievements they had never imagined. Mathematical concepts that had seemed abstract in college classrooms revealed themselves as practical tools for defending democracy. Language skills developed through literature courses became weapons against fascism. The analytical thinking they had been encouraged to apply to domestic problems proved equally effective when directed against the most sophisticated military challenges of their time. Yet the growth in responsibility came with an increasing burden of isolation. As their work became more sensitive and their knowledge more valuable, the walls of secrecy around them grew higher and thicker. They learned to compartmentalize not just their professional lives, but their emotional lives as well, developing the psychological defenses necessary to carry deadly, serious secrets while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in their personal relationships. Letters from home took on a different quality as the women became more deeply embedded in their secret world. News of domestic concerns, war bond drives, community celebrations seemed to arrive from a parallel universe, where people worried about problems that felt insignificant compared to the life and death decisions being made based on cryptanalytic intelligence. Yet these same letters provided crucial emotional anchors, reminding the women why their work mattered and what they were fighting to preserve. The relationship between the American and British cryptanalytic efforts deepened as the war progressed, creating informal networks of collaboration that transcended official channels. Women working at Arlington Hall found themselves corresponding with their counterparts at Bletchley Park, sharing techniques and insights that improved the effectiveness of both operations. These professional relationships often developed into genuine friendships, creating bonds between women who understood each other's work in ways that even their closest family members could not. As 1943 drew to a close, the women could sense that their efforts were beginning to tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. The intelligence they provided was becoming more timely, more accurate, and more comprehensive. Military operations that would have been impossible without advanced knowledge of enemy intentions were succeeding beyond the most optimistic expectations. The secret war of mathematics and intuition was being won, one decrypted message at a time. But victory would bring its own challenges, its own losses, and its own demands for continued secrecy. The women who had discovered their intellectual capabilities in the service of their country would soon face the question of what to do with those capabilities once peace returned. The skills they had developed, the confidence they had gained, and the knowledge they carried would shape the rest of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. In the quiet moments between shifts, between the endless stream of encrypted messages and mechanical calculations, they sometimes allowed themselves to imagine what their post-war lives might hold. Would they return to the traditional roles society expected of women, or had their wartime experiences changed them too fundamentally for such a return to be possible? The answer lay hidden in the future, as encrypted and unknowable as the enemy. Messages they spent their days unraveling, waiting for the key that would reveal its secrets. Machines who had become extensions of themselves. Silent partners in an intricate dance of war, fought not with bullets or bayonets, but with patience, precision, and the quiet determination of women who understood that every cipher broken might mean another soldier returning home. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Naval Communications Annex on Nebraska Avenue, the bomb deck hummed with the constant rhythm of mechanical calculation. 120 machines, each standing 6 feet tall and weighing more than a ton, filled the cavernous space with their relentless clicking and worry. The air was thick with the heat of electrical circuits working at their limits. Vacuum tubes glowing like amber stars in the perpetual twilight of the windowless rooms. Ensign Dorothy Leverance moved between the machines with the practiced grace of a conductor orchestrating a symphony of mathematics. Her hands, steady despite the early hour, adjusted rotors and checked connections with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. Each bomb contained the mechanical equivalent of 36 Enigma machines, their bronze rotors spinning through millions of possible combinations, in search of the one arrangement that would unlock the day's German naval messages. The women called them bombs because of the ticking sound they made, like time bombs counting down to revelation. But there was something almost gentle in the way the waves approached these mechanical giants, their voices soft and respectful as they coaxed secrets from the spinning drums. They had learned to read the machine's moods, to sense when a rotor was slightly out of alignment or when the electrical connections needed adjustment. Margaret Gilman, barely 22 and fresh from a mathematics degree at Mount Holyoke, placed her ear against the side of her assigned bomb, listening for the subtle change in rhythm that would signal a potential breakthrough. The machine had been running the same problem for 6 hours, systematically testing wheel positions based on small pieces of known plaintext that cryptanalysts had identified within the encrypted messages. When a bomb found a possible solution, it would stop with a definitive mechanical clunk that could be heard across the room. The women called this moment a stop, and it brought with it a surge of adrenaline that made hearts race and hands tremble with excitement. But most stops were false alarms, the machine having found a mathematical coincidence rather than the true key. It was Margaret's job to test each stop, running the suspected settings through additional checks to determine if they had truly broken that day's naval enigma traffic. The work required absolute precision. A single misaligned rotor, a loose connection, or a transcription error could send the bomb down an entirely wrong path, consuming precious hours that might mean the difference between intercepting a U-boat Wolfpack's coordinates and watching Allied merchant ships disappear beneath the dark Atlantic waters. Every number mattered, every setting was crucial. Every moment counted in ways the young women were only beginning to understand. 3 floors above the bomb deck, in a smaller, even more secure room, a different kind of machine work was taking place. The waves who operated the Colossus computers at the British Government Code and Cipher School had been sworn to secrecy so profound that they were instructed to tell anyone who asked that they spent their days doing filing and secretarial work. But Eleanor Ireland and her colleagues knew they were operating the most advanced electronic computers in the world. Machines that existed only in this place, for this purpose, in this desperate time. The Colossus stood 10 feet high and filled an entire wall, its panels covered with hundreds of switches, meters, and blinking lights. Unlike the mechanical bombs, Colossus was purely electronic, its vacuum tubes processing information at speeds that seemed almost magical to the women who fed it problems. where the bombs attacked the relatively simple Enigma cipher, Colossus, tackled the far more complex Lorenz machine used by Hitler and his high command for their most sensitive communications. Eleanor approached her station with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. The paper tape in her hands contained intercepted radio transmissions that had traveled from Berlin to army group commanders across occupied Europe. The tape was punched with holes representing the encrypted characters, and her job was to guide it through Colossus's optical readers at just the right speed and tension. The tape had to be joined into a perfect loop, and this seemingly simple task had taken weeks to master. Too much glue and the tape would stick in the readers. Too little, and it would separate under the tremendous tension of high-speed processing. Eleanor had learned to use exactly the right amount of fish glue, applied with French chalk and pressed with a warm iron, creating joints that could survive hours of continuous operation at thousands of characters per second. When Colossus was running, the room filled with an almost musical sound, the whisper of tape moving through guides, the electronic hum of computation, and the soft clicking of relays switching states thousands of times per minute. The women worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining the machines in a state of constant operation that pushed both technology and human endurance to their limits. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the night shift spoke in whispers, the true weight of their responsibilities settled over the women like a familiar but heavy cloak. They carried secrets that could change the course of nations, information that might save thousands of lives or doom them. Yet they carried these burdens with the same quiet strength with which they had once carried school books or helped their mothers with household tasks. Anne Caracristy sat at her desk in Arlington Hall, surrounded by sheets of paper covered with seemingly random 5-digit number groups. To anyone else, they would have appeared meaningless, the cryptographic equivalent of ancient hieroglyphics. But Anne could read the patterns hidden within the chaos, could sense the underlying structure. That revealed when Japanese naval forces were planning to move, where submarines might surface, what the enemy's next strategic objective might be. She had been working on the Japanese fleet code designated JN25 for 18 months, long enough to recognize the subtle variations in addressing systems that indicated different classes of ships, the patterns in date-time groups that revealed operational priorities, the tiny inconsistencies that suggested when code clerks were tired or rushed, or had made crucial errors that provided openings for American cryptanalysts. The work required a kind of mental discipline that few people possessed. Anne had to hold dozens of possible interpretations in her mind simultaneously, testing each against known patterns, while remaining alert for entirely new approaches that might suddenly illuminate a previously opaque passage. It was like solving a crossword puzzle where most of the clues were missing and the answers could determine the fate of battleships. Around her, other women worked on different aspects of the same vast puzzle. Some focused on the additives, random number groups that were added to the basic code to provide an extra layer of security. Others specialized in recovery of the code groups themselves, painstakingly reconstructing the Japanese Navy's vocabulary from partially broken messages and context analysis. Still others worked on traffic analysis, mapping the flow of communications to understand operational patterns even when the content remained opaque. The young women had developed their own informal support systems, ways of sharing the psychological burden of work that demanded perfection but offered no immediate feedback about success or failure. They formed study groups that met after hours, pooling their expertise to tackle particularly difficult problems. They developed friendships that transcended military rank and civilian status, bonds forged in the crucible of shared responsibility for vital but invisible work. Virginia Untold had been recruited directly from her mathematics teaching position. At a small college in Texas, the Navy had given her 2 weeks to arrange her affairs and report to Washington, D.C., for duties they described only as important to the war effort. She had arrived expecting clerical work and instead found herself assigned to the purple section, working on the Japanese diplomatic cipher that Genevieve Grotchen had broken in 1940. By 1943, purple was a known system, but it remained fiendishly complex to operate. The cipher machine itself was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity, using 25 telephone selector switches arranged in a precise pattern that changed with each message. Virginia's job was to operate the analog machine that American Krypton had built to mirror the Japanese original, carefully setting switches and rotors according to the key settings that had been determined for each day. The work required absolute concentration. A single wrong switch setting would produce gibberish instead of decrypted text, and there was no way to verify accuracy except by reading the resulting Japanese plaintext and confirming that it made operational sense. Virginia had taught herself enough Japanese to recognize common diplomatic phrases, military terminology, and the formal language patterns that characterize different types of messages. She often worked alone in the purple room, the only sound the soft clicking of switches, and the scratch of her pencil as she transcribes the decrypted text. The messages she revealed contained Japan's most sensitive diplomatic communications instructions to ambassadors, assessments of American intentions, strategic discussions between Tokyo and field commanders that provided invaluable intelligence about enemy plans and capabilities. But Virginia rarely learned how her work contributed to specific military operations. The intelligence she produced was transmitted through channels so secure that even she was not authorized to know where it went or how it was used. She worked in a bubble of classification that kept her focused on technical excellence while insulating her from the broader strategic implications of her discoveries. The women developed routines that helped them cope with the strange temporal rhythms of shift work and the psychological demands of maintaining absolute secrecy about their duties. They learned to sleep during daylight hours when necessary, to eat meals at irregular times, to find moments of normalcy within the rigid structure of military life and classified work. At Arlington Hall, the former National Park Seminary for girls had been transformed into the world's largest message center, its elegant dormitories converted into barracks for hundreds of Army cryptographers. The irony was not lost on the women who now occupied rooms where wealthy young ladies had once studied languages and music. They were still studying languages, in a sense, but these were the artificial languages of cryptography, mathematical constructs designed to hide meaning rather than reveal it. Ruth Briggs walked the tree-lined paths between buildings, carrying folders of intercepts that would spend the day being analyzed, compared, and slowly deciphered by teams of specialists. She had been assigned to traffic analysis, a discipline that studied the patterns of enemy communications, even when the content remained encrypted, by mapping who communicated with whom, when messages were sent, and how frequently certain addresses appeared. Traffic analysts could construct detailed pictures of enemy organizational structures and operational patterns. Ruth's work involved creating elaborate charts and diagrams that tracked the flow of Japanese naval communications across the Pacific. She plotted message volumes, identified new call signs as they appeared, and noticed when established communication patterns suddenly changed often, indicating that major operations were being planned. or that organizational structures had been modified. The work required a kind of detective's intuition combined with mathematical precision. Ruth had to notice subtle patterns while avoiding the trap of seeing meaning in random variations. She developed techniques for visualizing communication networks, using different colored pencils to represent different types of traffic and creating time series charts that revealed cyclical patterns in enemy communications. Her supervisor, Major John Hurt, had learned to trust Ruth's analytical instincts. She had been the first to notice that Japanese submarine communications followed a 28-day cycle that corresponded to lunar phases, information that proved invaluable for predicting when and where submarine operations might be intensified. She had also identified changes in call sign patterns that preceded major fleet movements, giving American naval intelligence crucial advance warning of enemy intentions. In the cryptanalysis sections, women worked with pencils and paper, slide rules and mechanical calculators, applying mathematical techniques that had been developed specifically for breaking enemy codes. The work was intellectually demanding, but also physically exhausting. Cryptanalysts might spend 8 hours hunched over desks covered with worksheets, testing hypotheses about key patterns, recovering plain text one character at a time through painstaking analysis. Genevieve Grotchen had been promoted to supervisor of the purple section after her breakthrough discovery, but she continued to work directly with the most difficult cryptanalytic problems. She had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how cipher machines operated, an ability to visualize the mechanical processes that transformed plain text into ciphertext, and to work backward from patterns in the encrypted messages to recover the underlying keys. Her days followed a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Morning briefings on new intercepts, assignment of problems to section personnel, personal work on the most challenging analytical tasks, afternoon review, sessions where team members shared discoveries and tested new approaches. Throughout it all, she maintained the calm, methodical approach that had made her breakthrough possible. The younger women in her section looked to Genevieve for guidance not just on technical matters, but on how to maintain perspective in work that could become all-consuming. She taught them to step back when problems seemed intractable, to trust their mathematical training while remaining open to unconventional approaches, to remember that every small discovery contributed to the larger effort even when its immediate significance was unclear. The relationship between the women and their machines developed into something more intimate than mere tool use. Each operator learned the quirks and characteristics of her assigned equipment, the subtle variations in performance that could signal mechanical problems or optimal operating conditions. They developed an almost tactile understanding of how to coax the best performance from temperamental technology. Betty Webb spent her days operating one of the Colossus computers at Bletchley Park, feeding the machine an endless stream of intercepted Lorentz traffic and adjusting settings according to instructions from the cryptanalysts who determined which problems to run. The work required constant attention and physical endurance. Colossus ran continuously, 24 hours a day, and any break in operation meant lost time that could never be recovered. She had learned to read the machine's moods through subtle changes in the patterns of lights on its control panels. When Colossus was running efficiently, the lights flickered in steady, rhythmic patterns that became almost hypnotic during long shifts. But mechanical problems announced themselves through irregular flashing, unusual sounds, or the sudden cessation of activity that meant someone would have to crawl behind the panels to locate and repair a failed vacuum tube or loose connection. The Colossus operators developed an informal rotation system for the most unpleasant tasks. Replacing burned-out vacuum tubes meant working in cramped spaces behind the machine panels, where temperatures could reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the risk of electrical shock was constant. Cleaning the optical readers that scanned. The paper tape required delicate work with special solvents and tools, since any residue could cause misreading that would invalidate hours of computation. Despite the physical demands and potential dangers, Betty found the work deeply satisfying. She understood that her machine was breaking the most secret communications of the German High Command, intelligence that flowed directly to Allied commanders, and influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels. The knowledge that her careful attention to mechanical details might contribute to saving lives gave meaning to even the most routine aspects of her duties. The WACs who operated the American bombs developed similar relationships with their machines. Each bomb had its own personality. Some ran slightly faster than others. Some were more prone to mechanical failures. Some required particular care in setting up the rotor configurations. The women learned to compensate for these individual characteristics, developing techniques that maximized each machine's effectiveness. Lieutenant Jimmy Lee Hutchison supervised a team of 40 WACs who worked in 3 shifts to keep the bomb deck running continuously. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a machine needed maintenance, when an operator was becoming fatigued and might make errors, when atmospheric conditions were affecting the delicate electrical circuits that drove the mechanical calculations. Jimmy Lee's daily routine involved not just operational supervision, but psychological support for women who were working under conditions of stress that few people could understand. The combination of responsibility for vital war work, the requirement for absolute secrecy, and the physical demands of shift work created pressures that could overwhelm even the most dedicated personnel. She developed techniques for maintaining morale that drew on her background as a teacher. Regular rotation of assignments prevented any individual from becoming too isolated with a particular type of work. Team meetings allowed the women to share technical discoveries and mutual support, without violating security requirements. Recognition for excellence, even when it had to remain within the confines of the classified work environment, helped maintain the high standards that the work demanded. The women also found ways to support each other that transcended official military channels. They formed informal study groups that met during off-duty hours to share mathematical techniques and problem-solving approaches. They created social activities that provided relief from the intensity of their work while maintaining the bonds of friendship and mutual respect that made effective teamwork possible. In the dormitories and barracks where they lived, the women talked about everything except their work. They discussed books and movies, shared letters from home, planned weekend excursions to nearby cities when leave was available. But always there was the unspoken understanding that the most important part of their lives remained off-limits too. Casual conversation, a shared burden that created bonds deeper than ordinary. Friendship. As 1943 deepened into 1944, the pace and intensity of cryptanalytic work increased dramatically. The Allies were planning the largest amphibious invasion in history, and the success of D-Day would depend partly on the intelligence provided by the women who worked in rooms that officially did not exist, solving problems that could not be acknowledged, making discoveries that would remain secret for decades. The pressure was subtle but constant. No one told the cryptographers that their work was directly supporting invasion planning, but they could sense the increased urgency in the problems they were assigned. The expanded operating hours, the growing numbers of personnel being assigned to cryptanalytic duties. The war was reaching a crucial phase. and their invisible contributions were becoming more vital than ever. Mary Preskill worked the midnight shift in the Japanese section at Arlington Hall, struggling with variants of JN-25 that had become increasingly complex as enemy cryptographers tried to stay ahead of American code-breaking efforts. The Japanese had begun changing their cipher systems more frequently, introducing new security measures, varying their communication procedures in ways that made pattern analysis more difficult. But Mary and her colleagues had also grown more sophisticated in their techniques. They had developed methods for attacking partially changed systems, techniques for exploiting the transitional periods when old and new procedures overlapped, mathematical approaches that could extract information from even heavily modified cipher systems. Her work required the kind of sustained concentration that few people could maintain for extended periods. Mary would spend entire shifts focused on a single message, testing different hypotheses about its structure, comparing it with similar messages from previous days or weeks, looking for the small inconsistencies or repetitions that might provide an opening for cryptanalytic attack. When she achieved a breakthrough, when patterns suddenly became clear and encrypted text transformed into readable Japanese, the satisfaction was intense but brief. There was no time for celebration, no opportunity to share the excitement of discovery with anyone outside the small group of specialists who could understand the significance of what had been accomplished. The solved message would be passed. 2 translators and intelligence analysts, and Mary would begin work on the next problem in an endless queue of encrypted communications. The women had learned to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in external recognition. They measured success by their own standards of technical excellence, by the respect of their immediate colleagues, by the private knowledge that they were contributing to the war effort in ways that no one else could fully appreciate. Captain Ann Mitchell supervised a section of 30 cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall, managing the delicate balance between individual expertise and team coordination that effective code-breaking required. She had learned that different people had different analytical strengths. Some excelled at pattern recognition, others at mathematical analysis, still others at the intuitive leaps that could illuminate entirely new approaches to difficult problems. Ann's challenge was to match personnel to problems in ways that maximized both individual satisfaction and collective effectiveness. She developed rotation systems that prevented anyone from becoming too narrowly specialized, while ensuring that the most difficult problems received attention from the most capable analysts. She fostered an environment of intellectual collaboration that encouraged sharing of techniques while maintaining the security requirements that governed all aspects of their work. Under her leadership, the section achieved breakthrough after breakthrough against Japanese naval codes, providing intelligence that flowed directly to Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet headquarters and influenced tactical decisions that determined the outcomes of crucial naval battles. But Ann's team never learned the specific operational results of their analytical work, never knew which of their discoveries had contributed to American victories or saved Allied lives. They worked in a bubble of technical focus that insulated them from the immediate consequences of their efforts while requiring them to maintain the highest possible standards of accuracy and speed. It was a psychological discipline that few people could sustain. But these women had found ways to make it bearable through mutual support and shared commitment to excellence. As spring turned toward summer in 1944, the tempo of work increased. Once again, new intercepts arrived in unprecedented volumes, requiring expanded shifts and additional personnel. The machines ran continuously, producing intelligence that supported operations the cryptographers could only guess at. And still, the women maintained their quiet professionalism, their methodical approach to problems that grew more complex with each passing day, their unshakable commitment to work that would remain hidden from history for decades to come, while battles raged across two oceans and the fate of nations hung in the delicate balance of their patient, persistent, invisible efforts. The winter of 1943 gave way to spring with an urgency that seemed to pulse through the corridors of Arlington Hall and the Naval Communications Annex. In the secure rooms where women bent over their machines and code sheets, there was a new tension in the air, not the familiar weight of daily duty, but something sharper, more electric. Though none of them knew the precise details, they could sense that something momentous was approaching, something that would test every skill they had learned, every hour they had practiced, every sacrifice they had made. In the spring months of 1944, the volume of intercepted German communications began to swell like a river approaching flood stage. Messages poured in from across the Atlantic, encoded transmissions that carried the weight of Nazi strategy, defensive preparations, troop movements, and supply routes. The women at Arlington Hall found themselves working longer shifts, their fingers flying across keyboards and their eyes straining over endless streams of encoded text that represented the enemy's most closely guarded secrets. Dorothy Leverance, now seasoned in the patterns of German Enigma traffic, noticed subtle changes in the communication patterns. The messages were becoming more frequent, more urgent, and they often contained references to coastal fortifications and beach defenses. She didn't know that her work was contributing to intelligence gathering for what would become known as D-Day, but she could feel the importance radiating from every decoded message like heat from a forge. Across the Atlantic, at Bletchley Park, the Wrens operating the Colossus machines were experiencing the same intensification. The great electronic brains hummed through the night, processing German high command communications encoded on the sophisticated Lorenz Cipher machines. Betty Webb found herself assigned to longer shifts, her hands growing steady and sure as she guided the paper tape through the photoelectric readers, watching for the patterns that might reveal German defensive strategies along what the Codebreakers had begun to recognize was likely to be an invasion coast. The machines seemed to sense the approaching climax, their mechanical hearts beating faster as if they, too, understood that history was gathering itself for a leap into the unknown. At the Naval Communications Annex in Washington, the waves operating the cryptanalytic bombs worked through the spring nights with an intensity that seemed to draw energy from the very air around them. Grace Mitchell had become expert at recognizing the subtle variations in German Enigma procedures that might indicate when a jackpot successful solution was imminent. The hot, noisy bomb room, filled with the sound of rotating wheels and clicking relays, had become her second home, and she moved through its maze of machinery with the confidence of a navigator reading familiar stars. The breakthrough that spring came not from any single dramatic moment, but from the accumulation of thousands of small victories, messages decoded, patterns recognized, intelligence gathered piece by piece, like fragments of a vast mosaic. The women working on German traffic began to see references to Atlantic wall fortifications, coastal artillery positions, and defensive obstacles. They decoded communications about troop movements and supply concentrations, though the bigger picture remained hidden from them behind layers of military secrecy. What they did know was that their work mattered more than ever. Ruth Briggs, working through her third consecutive night shift at Bletchley Park, felt it in the urgent whispers of the supervisors, in the way messages were rushed away as soon as they were decoded, in the electric atmosphere that seemed to charge the very walls of the Victorian mansion. The war was approaching some kind of climax, and their work was helping to shape whatever was coming in the Pacific Theater. The women working on Japanese codes faced their own intensifying challenges. The purple diplomatic cipher had long since been mastered, but the Japanese military continued to modify and complicate their naval codes, particularly the one known to American cryptographers as JN25. This cipher carried the operational orders for Japanese fleet movements, submarine deployments, and defensive preparations across the vast Pacific battlefield. Genevieve Grotchin, her reputation now firmly established after her breakthrough with Purple, found herself leading teams of women analysts through the labyrinthine complexities of Japanese naval communications. The work required not just mathematical skill, but an almost intuitive understanding of Japanese military thinking, the ability to recognize patterns not just in numbers and letters, but in the minds of enemy commanders thousands of miles away. The women working on Japanese traffic began to notice preparations for what appeared to be major defensive operations. Communications about aircraft deployments to Pacific Islands, submarine positioning, and defensive construction projects painted a picture of an empire preparing for a great assault. Like their colleagues working on German codes, they sensed that their routine work was building toward something enormous, though the details remained hidden behind the walls of military strategy. As the intensity of their work increased, so did the psychological burden carried by the women codebreakers. They lived in a world of profound secrecy, unable to share the stress and excitement of their work with family, friends, or even with most of their colleagues. The weight of what they knew and couldn't say began to show in subtle ways. The careful distance they maintained in conversations, the practiced vagueness when asked about their work, the growing sense of isolation that came from carrying secrets that could change the course of history. Eleanor Ireland, operating the massive Colossus computers at Bletchley Park, found that the constant noise and heat of the machine room had begun to invade her dreams. She would wake in her dormitory bed, still hearing the whisper of paper tape through photoelectric readers, still seeing the patterns of holes that represented enemy communications flowing past like some endless river of coded meaning. The machine's rhythms had become so much a part of her daily existence that silence felt wrong, empty, incomplete. The supervisors at both Arlington Hall and Bletchley Park began to notice signs of strain among their workers. Women who had seemed endlessly resilient were beginning to show fatigue. Not just physical tiredness, but something deeper. Weariness that came from carrying the weight of war without being able to share that burden. Medical officers reported increasing cases of insomnia, headaches, and what they carefully described as nervous conditions related to the stress of highly classified work. Anne Caracristy, working at Arlington Hall on some of the most sensitive Japanese diplomatic traffic, found herself developing what she later described as a kind of hypervigilance, an inability to completely relax even during off-duty hours. The habits of secrecy had become so ingrained that she found herself automatically censoring her thoughts, watching her words even in casual conversation, maintaining the mental barriers that kept her work separate from her personal life. They carried the war inside themselves, these women, in ways that would only be understood decades later, when the full scope of their contribution could finally be told. But the psychological burden came with its own strange compensations. The women working in cryptography had developed an almost mystical relationship with their work, finding in the patterns of enemy communications a kind of abstract beauty that transcended the grim realities of war. Breaking a particularly difficult cipher became not just a professional accomplishment, but something approaching artistic achievement, the moment when chaos resolved into meaning. When mathematical beauty revealed itself through the architecture of enemy thinking, Dorothy Duboisson, perfecting her technique with the delicate paper tape joints that kept the Colossus machines running, found a meditative quality in the precise application of glue and French chalk, the careful adjustment of tension that could mean the difference between success and failure. The work required a kind of focused attention that pushed everything else from her mind: worry about brothers fighting overseas, anxiety about rationing and blackouts, even homesickness for the life she had known before the war. The camaraderie among the women provided another kind of strength. In the dormitories and dining halls, over hurried meals between shifts, they developed friendships forged by shared experience of work that no one else could fully understand. They learned to read each other's moods, to recognize the signs of a successful breakthrough in a colleague's face, to provide wordless support during the inevitable frustrations and failures that came with attacking the most sophisticated ciphers. In military history, these friendships transcended traditional social boundaries. Women from small farming towns worked alongside graduates of prestigious universities. Daughters of immigrants labored next to descendants of colonial families. The common language of mathematics and the shared mission of winning the war created bonds that might never have formed in peacetime society. In the strange democracy of wartime cryptography, competence mattered more than pedigree, and dedication counted more than social standing. On June 6, 1944, the world learned what the women codebreakers had been preparing for through the long spring months. The Allied invasion of Normandy marked the opening of the long-awaited Second Front in Europe, and the intelligence gathered through their painstaking work on German communications proved crucial to the operation's success, though none of them would know the full extent of their contribution until decades later. Their work had helped identify German defensive positions, troop concentrations, and supply routes that proved vital to the invasion planners. In the days following D-Day, the tempo of work at the cryptographic centers reached fever pitch. German communications networks went into overdrive as Nazi commanders tried to coordinate their response to the invasion, and every message intercepted and decoded provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements, reinforcement schedules, and defensive strategies. The women at Arlington Hall and Bletchley Park found themselves working around the clock, sustained by the knowledge that their work was directly supporting the soldiers fighting on the beaches of France. Betty Webb, monitoring German communications traffic at Bletchley Park, began to notice a change in the tone and frequency of the messages flowing through the Colossus machines. Where once the communications had carried an air of confidence, even arrogance, now they seemed increasingly desperate, filled with requests for reinforcements, reports of supply shortages, and urgent queries about the status of defensive positions. The mathematical patterns she had grown so familiar with began to reflect the growing chaos within the German command structure. The breakthrough in the Pacific came later that summer, as American forces prepared for their assault on the Japanese-held Mariana Islands. The women working on Japanese naval codes had succeeded in penetrating deep enough into the JN-25 cipher system to provide crucial intelligence about Japanese fleet movements and defensive preparations. The intelligence flowing from their work would prove instrumental in the American victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japanese naval aviation suffered catastrophic losses that effectively ended their ability to project power across the Pacific. Grace Mitchell, working the night shift on the bomb machines at the Naval Communications Annex, felt the change in the rhythm of German Enigma communications as the summer progressed. The messages were becoming more desperate, more confused, filled with contradictory orders and urgent requests for information. She couldn't know that her work was helping to reveal the growing disarray within the German military command. But she could sense the change like a shift in the weather, in the silence between the clicking of machine keys and the whisper of tape through readers. They could almost hear the sound of empire crumbling, though they would not know for certain until the war's end that their work had hastened that collapse. The women's contribution to intelligence gathering extended far beyond the dramatic battles that made headlines. Their daily work on routine communications provided a constant stream of intelligence about enemy logistics, morale, and strategic thinking. Dorothy Leverance, analyzing patterns in German Enigma traffic, began to notice increasing references to fuel shortages, equipment failures, and transportation difficulties that painted a picture of an enemy increasingly unable to maintain effective operations. The psychological impact of these successes was profound. The women who had spent months and sometimes years attacking seemingly impossible ciphers began to see concrete evidence that their work was having real impact on the war's progress. The abstract mathematical beauty of cryptanalysis took on new meaning when they could see how their breakthroughs translated into saved lives and military victories. Ruth Briggs, working through another night shift at Bletchley Park, found herself thinking about the soldiers who might benefit from the intelligence her work provided. Each successfully decoded message might reveal an enemy ambush, expose a supply convoy to attack, or uncover defensive preparations that could save Allied lives. The connection between her careful analysis of mathematical patterns and the survival of men fighting thousands of miles away created a sense of purpose that sustained her through the long hours and difficult conditions. As autumn arrived in 1944, the women working on German communications began to notice what intelligence analysts would later recognize as signs of approaching collapse. Communications became increasingly fragmented and desperate. References to ammunition shortages, fuel crises, and transportation breakdowns multiplied. The orderly precision that had once characterized German military communications gave way to something approaching chaos. The work was becoming easier in some ways, as German cipher security began to break down under the pressure of military crisis. Operators under stress began making mistakes, reusing cipher settings, and sending messages in formats that made cryptanalysis simpler. But the easier ciphers brought their own psychological burden. The women could see more clearly now the desperation in enemy communications, the human cost of the war they were helping to win in the Pacific Theater. American advances following the successful invasion of the Philippines brought new challenges and opportunities for the women working on Japanese codes. As Japanese communications networks came under increasing pressure, cipher security began to deteriorate there as well. Messages that once would have taken weeks to decrypt were being broken in days or even hours, providing intelligence that proved crucial to American island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific. Anne Caracrosty, analyzing Japanese diplomatic traffic at Arlington Hall, began to see increasing evidence of attempts by some Japanese officials to explore possibilities for ending the war. The diplomatic codes carried increasingly desperate assessments of Japan's strategic position, requests for mediation through neutral countries, and debates about the possibilities for negotiated peace. Though the war would continue for almost another year, the seeds of Japan's eventual surrender were already visible in the communications flowing through her. Careful analysis, as winter settled over the secret facilities, where the women worked, the nature of their mission began to change, subtly but fundamentally. The work continued with the same intensity, but now it carried the strange quality of a story approaching its end. The intelligence they gathered increasingly revealed not enemy strength, but enemy weakness. Not defensive preparations, but preparations. For retreat, not strategic planning, but increasingly desperate attempts to delay the inevitable. Eleanor, Ireland. Operating the Colossus machines through the winter nights of 1944-45, processed communications that told the story of a German high command struggling to maintain control over a disintegrating empire. The Lorentz Cipher machines still encrypted the most sensitive Nazi communications. But those communications now carried reports of retreating armies, abandoned positions, and desperate requests for reinforcements that no longer existed. The psychological effect on the women was complex and sometimes contradictory. The approaching victory brought relief and satisfaction, but also a strange kind of melancholy. The work that had given their lives such intense meaning and purpose would soon be ending. The friendships forged in the crucible of wartime secrecy would scatter as the women returned to interrupted civilian lives or sought new purposes in peacetime. More challenging still was the continuing requirement for absolute secrecy. Even as victory approached, the women could not share their excitement, their sense of accomplishment, or their anticipation with anyone outside their closed circle. They would have to carry their pride in their contribution to victory as another secret, perhaps the most difficult one of all to bear. Dorothy Duboyson, perfecting her final paper tape joints for the Colossus machines, thought about the strange intimacy she had developed with the mechanical rhythms that had structured her life for the past 2 years. The sound of photoelectric readers processing encoded German communications had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Soon those sounds would be silenced, the machines would be shut down, and the secret world in which she had found purpose and identity would disappear as if it had never existed. They had lived through history, these women helping to shape it, through work that would remain invisible for decades, their contribution known only to themselves and the colleagues who shared their secret burden. The final months of the war brought a strange mixture of triumph and anticlimax to the cryptographic centers. The intelligence flowing from decoded enemy communications painted an increasingly clear picture of approaching defeat. But the work continued with mechanical precision. Each message still had to be intercepted, decoded, analyzed, and disseminated. Each shift still required the same attention to detail, the same mathematical precision, the same absolute commitment to accuracy that had characterized their work from the beginning. Grace Mitchell, working her final shifts on the bomb machines at the Naval Communications Annex, found herself memorizing the sounds and rhythms that had structured her wartime life. The clicking of rotors, the mechanical whisper of the machines searching for cipher solutions, the sudden silence that marked a successful breakthrough, all of it would soon be history, and she would be among the few who remembered what it had really been like to fight a war with mathematics and determination. As spring returned in 1945, the women working on German communications began to notice a fundamental change in the character of the traffic they processed. Where once the messages had carried the weight of strategic planning and operational coordination, now they seemed increasingly concerned with simple survival. Reports of ammunition shortages gave way to reports of food shortages. Strategic retreats became outright collapses. The mathematical patterns they had studied so intensively began to reflect not the workings of a military machine, but the final spasms of a dying regime. The news of Franklin Roosevelt's death in April cast a shadow. over the cryptographic centers, though the work continued without interruption. The women had grown accustomed to carrying on regardless of external events, maintaining their focus on the immediate requirements of their mission while history unfolded around them. But Roosevelt's death felt different, more personal somehow, as if the war itself was aging and changing in ways that went beyond mere military developments. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the reaction in the cryptographic centers was surprisingly muted. The women had seen the collapse coming through months of decoded communications, had tracked the progressive disintegration of German command and control through the messages they processed. Victory in Europe felt less like a dramatic climax than like the final confirmation of patterns they had been observing for months. But the celebration was necessarily private, confined to the secure spaces where they worked. The women could not fully share their knowledge of how completely they had penetrated German communications, how thoroughly they had tracked the enemy's final collapse, how significant their contribution had been to the Allied victory. Their triumph remained secret, known only to themselves and their colleagues in the invisible war fought with cipher machines and mathematical analysis. The war in the Pacific continued, and with it the women's work on Japanese communications. But now their efforts took on a different quality, focused not on supporting offensive operations, but on gathering intelligence that might help bring the conflict to a close with minimal further bloodshed. The diplomatic codes carried increasingly urgent discussions of peace possibilities, while the military communications revealed a Japanese preparing for a desperate final defense of the home islands. Genevieve Grotchen, continuing her analysis of Japanese communications through the summer of 1945, processed messages that revealed the growing debate within Japanese leadership about the possibilities for ending the war. The same mathematical skills that had broken the purple cipher now helped track the complex political maneuvering as Japanese officials explored options for surrender while maintaining some vestige of national honor. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, the women working on Japanese communications witnessed the immediate impact through the enemy's own eyes. The intercepted messages carried confusion, horror, and the growing recognition that Japan's position had become completely untenable. Within days, the communications reflected preparation for surrender, though the formal announcement would not come for several more days. The final surrender of Japan in September 1945 marked not just the end of the war, but the end of an era for the women who had fought it with their minds and determination. The massive apparatus of wartime cryptography would be scaled back, reorganized, and redirected toward new challenges, but it would never again require the same total mobilization of intellectual resources that had characterized the war years. As the women prepared to return to civilian life or transition to peacetime roles, many found themselves struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had helped win the greatest war in human history through work that remained largely invisible to the world. Their contribution would remain classified for decades, their stories untold, their achievements unrecognized except by those who had shared their secret burden. They had saved countless lives through work that required them to remain silent about their service. They had shortened the war through dedication that brought no public recognition. They had served their country through sacrifice that could never be fully acknowledged, but in the quiet satisfaction of work well done, in the knowledge that they had risen to meet history's greatest challenge, in the bonds forged with colleagues who shared their secret pride. They carried something that no public recognition could have provided. They had been present at the creation of the modern world, helping to shape it through patience, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to a cause greater than themselves. And as they packed their belongings and prepared to leave the places where they had spent the most meaningful years of their lives, they carried with them the quiet knowledge that when their country had needed them most, they had answered the call with everything they had to give. As spring blossomed across Europe in 1945, the machines at Bletchley Park hummed with an urgency that carried within it the promise of peace. The women who had spent years in the shadow of secrecy, their fingers dancing across keys and dials, their minds wrestling with the mathematical mysteries of war, could sense something shifting in the very air they breathed, though they were never told directly. The rhythm of their work had changed. Fewer desperate overnight sessions, fewer emergency calls to the code rooms, and a strange new quality to the messages they processed. Eleanor Ireland noticed it first, in the way the Colossus machines seemed to breathe easier. The great electronic giants, with their thousands of valves glowing like amber stars, no longer screamed with the frantic pace of desperate intercepts. The tapes still ran through their mechanical hearts, but there was something almost ceremonial now in their operation, as if they were processing the final chapters of a very long and terrible story. In the Naval Communications Annex on Nebraska Avenue, Ruth Weston felt the change in the quality of silence between the bomb machines. The waves who operated them still maintained their shifts with military precision, but conversations had begun to carry whispers of what might come after. What did one do when the greatest secret of the age was no longer needed? How did one return to a world that would never know what they had accomplished? Anne Caracristy, working late into the night at Arlington Hall, found herself staring at a decoded Japanese message that seemed to speak of endings rather than strategies. The mathematical patterns that had become second nature to her, the frequencies and correlations that revealed the hidden meanings behind enemy communications, were beginning to shift toward discussions of surrender, of defeat, of a world weary of war. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, the woman they called Miss Aggie, who had given her life to the science of cryptology, walked through the halls of the Naval Security Station with the measured pace of someone who had witnessed history from inside its most closely guarded secrets. She had broken code after code, taught countless others the delicate art of finding patterns in chaos. And now she sensed that the greatest pattern of all was drawing to its conclusion. The women had become part of something larger than themselves, a vast network of intelligence that stretched across continents and touched every major decision of the war. Yet they worked in isolation, knowing only their small piece of the enormous puzzle, never quite seeing the complete picture their efforts had helped to create. They were the guardians of shadows, the keepers of whispers, the silent architects of victory. When the news of Germany's surrender reached Bletchley Park on May 8, 1945, it came not with fanfare but with a peculiar quiet that settled over the Victorian mansion like morning mist. The women who had spent years listening to the enemy's most secret thoughts suddenly found themselves listening to silence. The intercepts that had driven their days and haunted their nights began to dwindle, and for the first time in years, the code rooms felt almost empty. Dorothy Boyson, who had mastered the art of joining paper tapes with just the right amount of glue and French chalk, found herself staring at a Colossus machine that no longer needed her expertise. The great electronic brain that had consumed her days with its demands for precision and speed now stood quiet, its thousands of valves cooling in the English spring air. She reached out to touch one of the switches she had operated thousands of times, and felt the strange sensation of saying goodbye to a machine that had been her partner in a war against chaos, the waves at Nebraska Avenue experienced their own former farewell. The bomb machines that had thundered through days and nights, seeking the daily settings of German Enigma machines, gradually fell silent. Louise Passol, who had learned to hear the subtle differences in the machine's mechanical voices, who could tell by sound alone when a rotor had found its proper position, walked among the now quiet giants and felt the weight of secrets she would carry for the rest of her life. But victory in Europe meant only a pause, not an ending. The Pacific War continued to rage, and the women who had broken German codes now turned their full attention to Japanese ciphers. At Arlington Hall, the work intensified as resources that had been divided between two theaters of war now focused on a single, desperate enemy. Genevieve Grotjen, whose breakthrough with the Purple Cipher had opened the door to Japanese diplomatic secrets, found herself working with a new urgency. The patterns she had learned to recognize in diplomatic traffic now carried hints of a nation preparing for its final stand. The mathematical relationships that revealed themselves in the intercepted messages spoke of desperation and determination in equal measure. The women processing Japanese naval codes worked with the knowledge that every message they decoded might save lives in the Pacific. The JN-25 cipher, which had revealed Japanese fleet movements and strategies, continued to flow through their analysis. Each decrypted message, a small victory against an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. As summer deepened, the pace of work at the American cryptographic centers reached new heights. The women who had proven themselves capable of the most demanding intellectual work now faced their greatest challenge: breaking the codes of an enemy that grew more secretive and more desperate with each passing day. August arrived with a heat that seemed to press down on Washington like a blanket, and in the code rooms of Arlington Hall and Nebraska Avenue, the women worked through the sweltering nights with a determination born of knowing that the end was near. The intercepts from Japan had taken on a quality that spoke of a nation wrestling with its own destruction. And the codebreakers who read these secret communications felt the weight of history settling on their shoulders. On August 6th, something changed in the rhythm of Japanese communications. The women processing radio intercepts noticed at first a strange disruption in the normal flow of military traffic, as if something had shocked the entire enemy communication system into temporary silence. They worked to decode the scattered messages that began to trickle through, not knowing that they were reading the first confused reports of a new kind of warfare that had been unleashed upon the world. Anne Caracristy found herself staring at a partially decoded message that spoke of unprecedented destruction, of a single bomb that had somehow obliterated an entire city. The mathematical precision that had guided her work for years seemed inadequate to comprehend the implications of what she was reading. This was not the clean logic of cryptography, but something that challenged the very foundations of what warfare could become. 3 days later, the pattern repeated. Another city, another message that spoke of impossible destruction. And in the code rooms, the women who had spent years learning to read the enemy's secrets found themselves reading what felt like the diary of a civilization coming to an end. The Japanese communications that followed carried a quality unlike anything the codebreakers had seen before. Where once there had been military precision and strategic planning, now there were messages that spoke of surrender negotiations, of a leadership grappling with the unthinkable prospect of defeat. On August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radio announcing surrender, the women in the American code rooms found themselves witnesses to one of history's most profound moments. They had read the secret preparations for this announcement, had decoded the diplomatic messages that paved the way for peace, had watched through the lens of intercepted communications as an empire chose survival over honor. The silence that followed was unlike anything they had experienced. For years, their world had been filled with the constant urgency of enemy communications, the endless stream of coded messages that demanded their attention and expertise. Now, suddenly, the flood had become a trickle, and then almost nothing at all. In the days following Japan's surrender, the great code-breaking centers began their transformation from instruments of war to repositories of secrets. The women who had given years of their lives to the work of breaking enemy codes found themselves facing a future that seemed both uncertain and strangely empty. What did one do when the most important work in the world was suddenly no longer needed? At Bletchley Park, the process of dismantling began with heartbreaking efficiency. The Colossus machines, those electronic marvels that had represented the cutting edge of computing technology, were systematically destroyed. Tommy Flowers, who had designed them, was ordered to burn the blueprints and operating manuals. The women who had operated these machines watched their destruction with the quiet grief of people saying goodbye to companions that had shared their most intense experiences. Eleanor Ireland stood in the empty Colossus room and remembered the heat from the thousands of valves, the constant hum of cooling fans, the precise tension required to feed paper tape through the photoelectric readers. All of it was gone now, reduced to scrap metal and fading memories. The machine that had helped win the war was erased as if it had never existed, its contribution to history destined to remain hidden for decades. The waves who had operated the bomb machines at Nebraska Avenue faced their own form of farewell. Louise Purcell watched as the machines were dismantled, their rotors packed away, their complex wiring reduced to components that revealed nothing of their former purpose. She had learned every sound the machines made, had developed an almost mystical connection to their mechanical rhythms, and now she was being asked to pretend that none of it had ever happened. The oath of secrecy that every woman had taken upon entering the world of cryptography now became a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had signed papers under the Official Secrets Act, had sworn to take their knowledge to their graves, and now they faced the prospect of returning to a civilian world that would never know what they had accomplished. Many of the women found themselves struggling with a transition. Ruth Weston, who had spent 3 years in the precise mathematical world of naval cryptography, tried to explain to her family why she couldn't talk about her war work. Secretarial duties, she told them, as she had been instructed, and watched their eyes glaze over with polite disinterest. How could she explain that she had helped crack codes that saved thousands of lives, that her work had shortened the war, and changed the course of history? Some women chose to remain in the field, joining the organizations that would eventually become the National Security Agency and the Government Communications Headquarters. Agnes Driscoll continued her cryptological work, her expertise too valuable to lose even in peacetime. But for most of the women who had served as codebreakers, the end of the war meant the end of their careers in cryptography. They returned to teaching, to marriage, to careers that seemed mundane after the intensity of wartime codebreaking. They carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something extraordinary. But they were forbidden from sharing that knowledge with anyone. They became keepers of the greatest secret of the 20th century, guardians of a story that the world was not yet ready to hear. The decades that followed the war passed like a slow tide, washing over the memories of the women who had broken codes and changed history. In the public consciousness, the story of World War II was told through the lens of battles and generals, of D-Day landings and Pacific campaigns. But the secret war fought in code rooms and cipher bureaus remained hidden from view. Dorothy Boyson returned to civilian life and found work as a secretary. Her extraordinary skills with the Colossus machine reduced to typing letters and filing reports. She married, raised children, and never spoke of the years when she had been part of the most advanced computing project in the world. When her children asked about the war, she smiled and said she had done her bit, leaving them to imagine something far more ordinary than the truth. Ruth Weston became a teacher, channeling her mathematical gifts into educating the next generation. Standing before her high school algebra classes, she sometimes found herself thinking about the complex calculations she had performed on bomb machines, about the patterns she had learned to recognize in German cipher systems. But she never shared these memories with her students, never hinted that their quiet mathematics teacher had once been part of the most sophisticated code-breaking operation in history. Anne Caracristy chose to remain in the world of cryptography, one of the few women who continued her career into the Cold War era. She watched as the techniques developed during World War II evolved to meet new challenges. As electronic computers replaced the mechanical calculators of wartime, she rose through the ranks of the National Security Agency, eventually becoming its deputy director. But even in her high position, she rarely spoke publicly about the women who had laid the foundation for modern cryptography. The silence was enforced not just by official secrecy, but by a cultural assumption that women's contributions to the war effort had been limited to traditional roles. The popular narrative of World War II celebrated the men who had stormed beaches and flown fighter planes, while the women who had fought the war with mathematics and logic remained invisible. Genevieve Grotjen, whose breakthrough with the purple cipher had been one of the most significant intelligence achievements of the war, returned to her work as a statistician and lived in quiet anonymity. Her neighbors knew her as a pleasant woman who had worked for the government during the war, but they had no idea that she had made discoveries that changed the course of history. The women who had operated the great machines of Bletchley Park and Arlington halls scattered across the world, carrying their secrets with them. Some emigrated to Canada or Australia, others remained in their home countries, but all of them shared the peculiar burden of having been part of something extraordinary that they could never discuss. They aged quietly, watching as the world they had helped to create evolved around them. The computer age that dawned in the 1960s and 1970s bore little resemblance to the electronic pioneers they had operated during the war, but they recognized the fundamental principles that drove the new technology. They had been present at the birth of the digital age, but their role as midwives to the future remained hidden. When they gathered for reunions, rare, unofficial meetings that violated no secrecy oaths but skirted their edges, they spoke in careful euphemisms about their war work. They remembered colleagues who had died without ever receiving recognition for their contributions. Women whose brilliance had been essential to victory, but whose names would never appear in history books. The first cracks in the wall of secrecy appeared in the 1970s, more than 30 years after the war's end. The British government, responding to pressure from historians and former codebreakers, began the slow process of declassifying some aspects of the Bletchley Park operation. The releases were limited and heavily censored, but they represented the first official acknowledgement that something extraordinary had taken place in the English countryside during the war. Brian Randell, a computer scientist who had been lobbying for the declassification of Colossus, was given permission to interview some of the engineers who had worked on the project. His 1976 paper, presented at a conference in Los Alamos, was the first public discussion of the machines that had preceded ENIAC as the world's first electronic computers. But even this revelation focused on the technical achievements while remaining silent about the human story of the women who had operated the machines. Eleanor Ireland, now in her 50s, read about the conference in a technical journal and felt a complex mixture of vindication and frustration. Finally, the world was learning about Colossus, but the stories being told were about circuits and valves, not about the women who had made the machines sing with purpose. She began to write her own account of her time at Bletchley Park, creating one of the first personal narratives of what it had been like to work with the electronic giants in America. The process of declassification was even slower. The National Security Agency, heir to the wartime code-breaking organizations, maintained strict control over information about cryptographic activities. The women who had worked for the Army and Navy during the war found themselves caught between their desire to share their stories and their continuing obligations to maintain secrecy. Louise Postwar, now a grandmother, tried to explain to her family why she couldn't discuss her Navy service in detail. Her grandchildren, growing up in the 1970s, found it difficult to understand why their grandmothers' wartime work remained classified decades after the conflict had ended. She could only smile and tell them that some secrets took a very long time to become safe to share. The computer revolution of the 1980s brought new attention to the wartime development of electronic computing, as personal computers became common, and the internet began to transform communication. Historians and technologists became increasingly interested in the origins of digital technology. Some began to suspect that the official history of computing, which credited ENIAC as the first electronic computer, was incomplete. Tony Sale, an engineer and curator at London's Science Museum, became obsessed with reconstructing one of the lost Colossus machines. Working with fragmentary documentation and the memories of surviving engineers, he began the painstaking process of rebuilding the technology that had been deliberately destroyed after the war. His project brought new attention to Bletchley Park and to the people who had worked there. As Sale's reconstruction progressed, some of the women who had operated the original machines began to emerge from their long silence. They contacted him with memories and corrections, helping him understand not just how the machines had worked, but how they had been used. For the first time in 40 years, their expertise was being sought and valued. The 1990s brought a cascade of revelations as governments on both sides of the Atlantic accelerated the declassification of wartime intelligence materials. The release of documents that had been sealed for 50 years began to reveal the true scope of the code-breaking effort and the crucial role it had played in Allied victory. In 1996, exactly 50 years after the war's end, the reconstructed Colossus at Bletchley Park came to life for the first time since 1945. The Duke of Kent switched on the machine in a ceremony that marked not just the technical achievement of reconstruction, but the beginning of public recognition for all those who had worked on the original project. Eleanor Ireland, now in her 70s, was among the former operators invited to see the rebuilt machine. Standing before the towering collection of valves and switches, she felt the memories flooding back, the heat from the electronic components, the precise timing required to feed paper tape through the readers, the satisfaction of watching the machine find patterns in chaos. She placed her hand on a switch she had operated thousands of times and whispered a greeting to an old friend. The American declassifications came more slowly but proved even more comprehensive. The release of documents from the National Security Agency and its predecessors revealed the vast scope of American code-breaking operations and began to illuminate the contributions of the thousands of women who had worked in the field. Liza Mundy, a journalist researching the role of women in wartime intelligence, began tracking down the survivors of the American code-breaking effort. Her interviews revealed stories that had been hidden for more than half a century, tales of mathematical brilliance, technical innovation, and quiet heroism that had shaped the course of the war. Anne Caracristy, who had risen to become one of the highest-ranking women in the intelligence community, finally felt free to discuss her wartime experiences. In interviews and speeches, she began to share the story of the women who had broken enemy codes, operated complex machines, and helped win the war through the power of their intellect. Genevieve Gratgen, the woman whose insight had broken the purple cipher, lived to see her contribution finally acknowledged. Approaching 90, she gave interviews about her wartime work and received recognition that was decades overdue. Her story became a symbol of the hidden contributions that women had made to the war effort. The revelations of the 1990s and 2000s transformed public understanding of World War II intelligence. The story of Bletchley Park became part of popular culture, celebrated in books, films, and television programs. The genius of Alan Turing was finally recognized, and with it came acknowledgement of the thousands of others who had worked alongside him. But even as the male codebreakers received their due recognition, the contributions of the women often remained in the shadows. The popular narrative continued to focus on the famous name-string flowers, the senior officials who had made strategic decisions, while the women who had done much of the day-to-day work remained largely anonymous. As the 21st century dawned, the last generation of women who had been active codebreakers during World War II entered their twilight years. They had lived long enough to see their work acknowledged, their contributions recognized, and their stories finally told. But they had also lived with the knowledge that recognition had come too late for many of their colleagues. Dorothy Dubois, now in her 80s, attended reunions at Bletchley Park, where she was treated as a celebrity by visitors who had come to learn about the wartime code-breaking operation. She enjoyed sharing her memories, but often reflected on the friends who had died without ever receiving such recognition. The women who had operated Colossus machines, who had broken German ciphers, who had saved countless lives through their mathematical skills, many had passed away in obscurity. Taking their stories with them, the internet age brought new opportunities for the surviving codebreakers to connect with each other and share their memories. Online forums dedicated to Bletchley Park history became gathering places for veterans who had been scattered across the world for decades. They could finally discuss details of their work that had been classified for more than half a century. Ruth Weston, inspired by the new openness about wartime intelligence, began writing her memoirs. She wanted to ensure that the story of the waves who had operated bomb machines would not be lost. Her account captured not just the technical details of the work, but the human experience, the exhaustion from night shifts, the satisfaction of a successful decryption, the camaraderie among women, doing extraordinary work under extraordinary circumstances. Academic historians began to revisit the narrative of World War II intelligence with new attention to the role of women. Janet Obitt led an oral history project that captured the memories of pioneering women in computing, including many who had started their careers in wartime codebreaking. These interviews preserved stories that might otherwise have been lost forever. The mathematical techniques developed by the women codebreakers found new relevance in the digital age. the pattern recognition skills that had been used to break Enigma ciphers were recognized as precursors to modern artificial intelligence. The statistical methods employed at Bletchley Park influenced the development of computer science and data analysis. Young women studying mathematics and computer science began to learn about role models they had never known existed. The story of Genevieve Grotjohn's breakthrough with the purple cipher inspired a new generation of cryptographers. The example of Ankarachristie's rise to leadership in the intelligence community showed that women could reach the highest levels of a traditionally male-dominated field. Museums and educational institutions began to develop exhibits that told the full story of wartime code breaking, including the crucial contributions of women. The National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park created displays that honored both the technical achievements and the human stories behind them. Schoolchildren could finally learn about the women who had helped win the war through the power of mathematics. As the women who had been codebreakers during World War II entered their final years, they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that their story had finally been told. The secrecy that had defined their lives for decades had been lifted, replaced by recognition and respect. But they also understood that their contributions represented just one chapter in the continuing story of the relationship between mathematics and human conflict. Eleanor Ireland, reflecting on her long life in one of her final interviews, spoke about the strange irony of having been present at the birth of the computer age while being forbidden to discuss it for most of her life. She had watched the world transform around technologies that grew from seeds planted during the war, had seen electronic computation evolve from room-sized machines with thousands of valves to devices that fit in people's pockets. The Colossus machines she had operated were primitive by modern standards, but they had established principles that guided all subsequent development. The cryptographic techniques that the women had mastered during the war evolved into the security systems that protected modern communication. Every online transaction, every encrypted message, every secure communication depended on mathematical principles that had been refined in the crucible of wartime necessity. The women who had broken enemy codes had laid the foundation for the systems that now protected civilian secrets. Ankarachrystie, looking back on her career in intelligence, noted how the challenges of the Cold War had required the same combination of mathematical skill and analytical insight that had characterized wartime codebreaking. The enemy communications that needed to be deciphered had become more sophisticated, but the fundamental human qualities required for success remained the same: patience, persistence, and the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. The institutional memory of the wartime code-breaking operations influenced the development of modern intelligence agencies. The Government Communications Headquarters in Britain and the National Security Agency in America both traced their lineage to the organizations that had employed the women codebreakers. The culture of these institutions, their methods and priorities, had been shaped by the experiences and insights of the women who had proven that intelligence work was not limited by gender. As the last survivors of the code-breaking generation passed away, they left behind more than just historical records. They had demonstrated that extraordinary achievements could emerge from ordinary people given the opportunity to use their talents in service of a greater cause. They had shown that the most important battles were not always fought with weapons, but with minds capable of solving impossible problems. The women who had broken codes during World War II became symbols of the hidden contributions that shape history. Their story challenged conventional narratives about who fought the war and how it was won. They represented thousands of others whose contributions had been overlooked or forgotten, whose achievements had been minimized or ignored. In universities and research institutions around the world, scholars continued to study the techniques and methods developed during the war, the mathematical innovations that had emerged from the urgent need to break enemy codes found applications in fields ranging from medicine to space exploration. The legacy of the women codebreakers extended far beyond their wartime achievements to influence the entire trajectory of technological development. The young women who entered careers in mathematics, computer science, and intelligence in the 21st century did so with knowledge of the pioneers who had come before them. They understood that they were following a path first blazed by women who had faced even greater obstacles and overcome them through talent, determination, and courage. The story of the women codebreakers had become part of the larger narrative of women's contributions to science and technology. It joined the accounts of other pioneering women who had made crucial discoveries while receiving little recognition, who had advanced human knowledge while being denied equal opportunities, who had changed the world while being excluded from the history books. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the women codebreakers demonstrated the power of secrets revealed. For decades, their achievements had been hidden from public view, their contributions unknown even to their own families. The eventual revelation of their story showed how history could be transformed by the release of information that had been suppressed, how the simple act of telling the truth could change our understanding of the past and our vision of the future. The women who had kept the secrets of Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall, who had carried their knowledge in silence for decades, had finally been able to share their stories. In doing so, they had given the world not just historical knowledge, but inspiration for the challenges that lay ahead. They had shown that the most powerful weapons against chaos and tyranny were not always physical but intellectual, not always visible but hidden in the quiet work of minds capable of extraordinary things. What we did was a big step forward and was very significant in the solution. Her discovery and the work of other team members allowed the United States to read secret Japanese diplomatic messages and to continue reading them throughout World War II. Frank Rallett, reflecting on Genevieve Grachon's breakthrough, and so the great machines fell silent, their work complete, their operators honored at last. The Colossus computers were destroyed, the bomb machines dismantled, the code rooms emptied of their urgent purpose. But the women who had breathed life into these mechanical minds carried forward something that could not be destroyed, the knowledge that they had helped change the world through the power of mathematics, logic, and unwavering dedication to a cause greater than themselves. In the quiet corners of memory, where the sound of clicking relays and worry tapes still echoed, the women codebreakers took their place among the hidden architects of the modern world. They had fought the war with symbols and equations, with patterns and probabilities, with the ancient human gift for finding order in chaos. And in winning that fight, they had not only helped defeat tyranny, but had opened the door to a future where information itself would become the most powerful force on Earth. The cipher had been broken, the message decoded, the secret finally told. But the greatest revelation was not what they had accomplished, but who they had been: ordinary women who, when called upon, had proven capable of extraordinary things. In classrooms and laboratories, in government offices and university halls, their legacy lived on in the work of those who followed, carrying forward the quiet revolution they had begun in the shadow years of war. Where once there had been silence, now there were stories. Where once there had been secrets, now there was knowledge. Where once there had been obscurity, now there was recognition. The women who had broken the unbreakable codes had finally broken the greatest cipher of all, the code of silence that had hidden their contributions from the world. And in that breaking, in that final revelation, they had given future generations not just a chapter of history, but a promise that no contribution born of talent and dedication would remain forever hidden, that no achievement made in service of justice would be permanently forgotten, and that the power of human intelligence, when focused on the greatest challenges, could overcome any obstacle, solve any puzzle, and decode any mystery that stood between the present and a better future. The last code had been broken, the final message had been read, and it spoke in the voices of thousands of women who had served in silence, of courage that needed no recognition, of brilliance that required no acclaim, and of service that had changed the world while asking nothing in return. Their story, hidden for so long, had finally joined the great narrative of human achievement, where it would remain as long as memory endured and mathematics continued to reveal the hidden patterns that govern our world. In the end, they had not only broken the enemy's codes, they had encoded within their own lives a message of hope that would outlast any war, transcend any conflict, and inspire generations yet to come. The women codebreakers of World War II had written their names, not in stone, but in the very foundations of the future, where they would remain eternal and unbreakable forever, forever. As the women who had been codebreakers during World War II entered their final years, they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that their story had finally been told. The secrecy that had defined their lives for decades had been lifted, replaced by recognition and respect. But they also understood that their contributions represented just one chapter in the continuing story of the relationship between mathematics and human conflict. Eleanor Ireland, reflecting on her long life in one of her final interviews, spoke about the strange irony of having been present at the birth of the computer age, while being forbidden to discuss it for most of her life. She had watched the world transform around technologies that grew from seeds planted during the war, had seen electronic computation evolve from room-sized machines with thousands of valves to devices that fit in people's pockets. The Colossus machines she had operated were primitive by modern standards, but they had established principles that guided all subsequent development. The cryptographic techniques that the women had mastered during the war evolved into the security systems that protected modern communication. Every online transaction, every encrypted message, every secure communication depended on mathematical principles that had been refined in the crucible of wartime necessity. The women who had broken enemy codes had laid the foundation for the systems that now protected civilian secrets. Anne Caracristy, looking back on her career in intelligence, noted how the challenges of the Cold War had required the same combination of mathematical skill and analytical insight that had characterized wartime code-breaking. The enemy communications that needed to be deciphered had become more sophisticated, but the fundamental human qualities required for success remained the same: patience, persistence, and the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. The institutional memory of the wartime code-breaking operations influenced the development of modern intelligence agencies. The Government Communications Headquarters in Britain and the National Security Agency in America both traced their lineage to the organizations that had employed the women codebreakers. The culture of these institutions, their methods and priorities, had been shaped by the experiences and insights of the women who had proven that intelligence work was not limited by gender. As the last survivors of the code-breaking generation passed away, they left behind more than just historical records. They had demonstrated that extraordinary achievements could emerge from ordinary people, given the opportunity to use their talents in service of a greater cause. They had shown that the most important battles were not always fought with weapons, but with minds capable of solving impossible problems. The women who had broken codes during World War II became symbols of the hidden contributions that shaped history. Their story challenged conventional narratives about who fought the war and how it was won. They represented thousands of others whose contributions had been overlooked or forgotten, whose achievements had been minimized or ignored. In universities and research institutions around the world, scholars continued to study the techniques and methods developed during the war, the mathematical innovations that had emerged from the urgent need to break enemy codes found applications in fields ranging from medicine to space exploration. The legacy of the women codebreakers extended far beyond their wartime achievements to influence the entire trajectory of technological development. The young women who entered careers in mathematics, computer science, and intelligence in the 21st century did so with knowledge of the pioneers who had come before them. They understood that they were following a path first blazed by women who had faced even greater obstacles and overcome them through talent, determination, and courage. The story of the women codebreakers had become part of the larger narrative of women's contributions to science and technology. It joined the accounts of other pioneering women who had made crucial discoveries while receiving little recognition, who had advanced human knowledge while being denied equal opportunities, who had changed the world while being excluded from the history books. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the women codebreakers demonstrated the power of secrets revealed. For decades, their achievements had been hidden from public view, their contributions unknown even to their own families. The eventual revelation of their story showed how history could be transformed by the release of information that had been suppressed, how the simple act of telling the truth could change our understanding of the past and our vision of the future. The women who had kept the secrets of Bletchley Park in Arlington Hall, who had carried their knowledge in silence for decades, had finally been able to share their stories. In doing so, they had given the world not just historical knowledge, but inspiration for the challenges that lay ahead. They had shown that the most powerful weapons against chaos and tyranny were not always physical but intellectual, not always visible but hidden in the quiet work of minds capable of extraordinary things. What we did was a big step forward and was very significant in the solution. Her discovery and the work of other team members allowed the United States to read secret Japanese diplomatic messages and to continue reading them throughout World War II. Frank Rowlett, reflecting on Genevieve Grotjohn's breakthrough and so the great machines fell silent, their work complete, their operators honored at last. The Colossus computers were destroyed, the bomb machines dismantled, the code rooms emptied of their urgent purpose. But the women who had breathed life into these mechanical minds carried forward something that could not be destroyed, the knowledge that they had helped change the world through the power of mathematics, logic, and unwavering dedication to a cause greater than themselves. In the quiet corners of memory, where the sound of clicking relays and worry tapes still echoed, the women codebreakers took their place among the hidden architects of the modern world. They had fought the war with symbols and equations, with patterns and probabilities, with the ancient human gift for finding order in chaos. And in winning that fight, they had not only helped defeat tyranny, but had opened the door to a future where information itself would become the most powerful force on Earth. The cipher had been broken, the message decoded, the secret finally told. But the greatest revelation was not what they had accomplished, but who they had been. Ordinary women who, when called upon, had proven capable of extraordinary things. In classrooms and laboratories, in government offices and university halls. Their legacy lived on in the work of those who followed, carrying forward the quiet revolution they had begun in the shadow years of war. Where once there had been silence, now there were stories. Where once there had been secrets, now there was knowledge. Where once there had been obscurity, now there was recognition. The women who had broken the unbreakable codes had finally broken the greatest cipher of all, the code of silence that had hidden their contributions from the world. And in that breaking, in that final revelation, they had given future generations not just a chapter of history, but a promise that no contribution born of talent and dedication would remain forever hidden, that no achievement made in service of justice would be permanently forgotten, and that the power of human intelligence, when focused on the greatest challenges, could overcome any obstacle, solve any puzzle, and decode any mystery that stood between the present and a better future. The last code had been broken. The final message had been read, and it spoke in the voices of thousands of women who had served in silence, of courage that needed no recognition, of brilliance that required no acclaim, and of service that had changed the world while asking nothing in return. Their story, hidden for so long, had finally joined the great narrative of human achievement, where it would remain as long as memory endured and mathematics continued to reveal the hidden patterns that govern our world. In the end, they had not only broken the enemy's codes, they had encoded within their own lives a message of hope that would outlast any war, transcend any conflict, and inspire generations yet to come. The women codebreakers of World War II had written their names, not in stone, but in the very foundations of the future, where they would remain eternal and unbreakable forever, forever.